A shipment of gold from Burkina Faso, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, was seized at a European port. There was no legal dispute, no accident. It was politics. Under direct pressure from Washington, the containers never reached their destination. And then came Trump's voice, sharp, unapologetic: if Africa wants access to global markets, it must pay its dues. In Ouagadougou, the news hit like an earthquake for President Ibrahim Traoré. This was not business, it was robbery. The gold mined by his people, the very wealth meant to build schools, fund hospitals, and secure food for millions, had been hijacked and turned into collateral for debts written by outsiders. Crowds flooded the streets, anger spreading like wildfire. "They steal in daylight and call it law," shouted one man at a rally. The truth was undeniable: if Africa's gold could be seized, then sovereignty itself was under attack. What began as a single shipment blocked at a port was about to ignite a larger fight over Africa's right to control its own future. The seizure was not an error, it was strategy. In Washington, Trump framed it as a lesson to the Sahel: if African nations wanted the benefits of global trade, they had to honor their debts. But behind the cameras, US officials admitted the real motive: the IMF. For decades, African loans had come tied to conditions written in Washington and Paris. Repayments had to be made in dollars, guaranteed by national resources. But as nations like Burkina Faso turned toward new partners in BRICS and India, the West grew nervous. What if those loans went unpaid? What if Africa simply walked away from the system? Trump's answer was ruthless: freeze the gold. By pressuring Europe to seize Burkina Faso's shipment, Washington sent a message: your resources are collateral, whether you agree or not. The logic was cold but clear. If Africa strayed from the IMF, its wealth would be stopped before it even left its borders. The revelation spread quickly. Ministers told Traore the gold had been classified as security against debts inherited from past regimes or forced under colonial era terms. Debts that had already drained Africa more than they ever gave back. It was the final insult. A farmer on local radio asked, "We never signed those loans, why should our gold pay for them?" A teacher added, "If they take our gold, they take the future of our children." Traore stood before his cabinet and spoke plainly: this is not about debt. This is about control. If they succeed, Africa will never own its tomorrow. Washington had achieved its goal in Europe, but in Africa, the effect was the opposite. The seizure was no longer just about gold, it was fueling something far more dangerous to Western power: African unity. If you believe Traore's courage represents the voice of Africa, share your thoughts in the comments. The streets of Ouagadougou erupted with fury, not confusion, but anger. News of the gold seizure spread like wildfire through radios, WhatsApp groups, and market loudspeakers. The shipment had not been stolen by pirates or delayed by storms. It had been seized deliberately, declared collateral for IMF debts. Mothers struggling to buy bread shouted in protest, "Whose gold is this, ours or theirs?" Young people carried signs reading, "Our gold is not your guarantee." The outrage was not only about money, it was about betrayal, the crushing realization that Africa's wealth was still treated as property in someone else's vault. Inside the presidential palace, Traore convened his closest advisors. Some urged diplomacy. "We can negotiate the release," one minister suggested nervously. "Offer repayment schedules, a compromise." But others shook their heads. The room was heavy with silence until Traore rose. His voice was calm but unyielding. "They want us to bow. They want us to pay debts we did not choose, with gold we mined with our blood. If we bend today, there will be nothing left to stand on tomorrow." His words struck like thunder. For the first time, his cabinet understood this was not just a financial dispute, it was an assault on sovereignty itself. Meanwhile, the protests swelled. Miners marched from the goldfields with their tools raised high, symbols of resistance. Students staged sit-ins at universities, demanding Burkina Faso cut its dependency on the IMF altogether. Even soldiers muttered in the barracks, "If they can seize gold, what will they seize next?" Western media, however, told a different story. CNN labeled Traore reckless. European commentators spoke of African instability. But within Africa, the narrative was shifting. The people saw not recklessness but defiance. And in that defiance, Ibrahim Traoré saw an opening. What was meant to humiliate Burkina Faso was instead uniting a continent around a single truth. Africa's wealth could no longer be trusted to foreign hands. The crisis had reached its breaking point. For days, Burkina Faso's newspapers carried a single headline: gold seized, nation betrayed. Radio hosts repeated Trump's words, Africa must pay its dues, until they echoed like a challenge carved into stone. The West believed it had made Africa kneel, but Ibrahim Traoré had other plans. He called an emergency session with leaders of the Alliance of Sahel States. Mali responded first, sending envoys to Ouagadougou with a message, "Your gold is our fight, too." Around the table, frustration burned. Each country carried stories of shipments delayed, reserves frozen, or contracts rewritten by foreign powers at will. The seizure, they realized, was not an isolated act, it was the system itself. Traoré laid the truth bare: they hold our gold because they know it is our strength. They call it collateral. I call it ransom. And if we accept this, the ransom will never end. The room fell silent until a Malian minister broke it. What if we stop sending gold through their ports? What if we keep it here in Africa? Heads turned. For the first time, a radical thought became a real possibility. Build an African reserve beyond the reach of the IMF or European treasuries. Outside, the momentum surged. Protesters no longer demanded only the release of the gold, they demanded transformation. Youth groups painted murals of Africa's resources chained to Western banks. Farmers pledged to contribute to a people's fund to support financial independence. What began as a shipment seized in Europe was now sparking the birth of a movement. Western governments dismissed the idea as fantasy. One European official scoffed, "They don't have the infrastructure or the unity." But what they underestimated was the one resource Africa had in abundance: determination. At the center of that determination stood Ibrahim Traoré, ready to turn scandal into the first step toward liberation. The proposal was bold, almost unthinkable: an African gold reserve, created and guarded on African soil, beyond the reach of Paris, Brussels, or Washington. For decades, such an idea had been dismissed as a dream. But after the humiliation at the European port, it sounded less like fantasy and more like survival. In the meeting hall, debate erupted. Some ministers warned of disaster. "If we break from the IMF, sanctions will crush us," argued one delegate. Another cautioned, "Without Western insurance, our exports will stall. Our economies could suffocate." Fear lingered in every corner of the room. Then Traoré cut through the noise. "They already suffocate us. Did the IMF save us when our reserves were frozen? Did sanctions feed our people? No, they steal with one hand and offer loans with the other. Enough." His words steadied the chamber. Support came swiftly. Niger's representative rose. "Our uranium is theirs only because we let them ship it. Why should we not guard it ourselves?" Mali's minister added, "We have watched for years as our gold left our soil only to fund their banks. If this is the moment to stop, let it be now." Beyond the walls, the message spread. Across Africa, news outlets began openly discussing the gold reserve. Analysts explained how pooling resources could shield the Sahel from currency manipulation. On the streets, people chanted, "Keep the gold, build the vault." In Europe, alarm bells rang. Financial newspapers warned of dangerous populism. Private memos described the project as a threat to the stability of global markets. Yet the more the West condemned it, the more legitimacy it gained in Africa. For the first time in generations, African leaders were not reacting to Western dictates, they were planning for themselves. And Traoré understood, even the hint of unity could shift the balance of power forever. Talk was no longer enough. Traoré ordered his economic advisors and military chiefs to draft concrete steps. The plan was simple in principle, but revolutionary in practice. Stop sending gold through European ports and begin building the infrastructure to secure it within Africa. Secret meetings followed. Engineers outlined how vaults could be constructed in secure zones reinforced by military protection. Economists mapped how reserves from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger could be pulled into a joint stock and African financial shield. But Traore knew this was about more than concrete walls or balance sheets. It was about trust. At a gathering of AES leaders, he spoke directly: "If we build this vault, it will not belong to Burkina Faso, nor Mali, nor Niger. It will belong to Africa. Our children must know their wealth is stored where no foreign hand can touch it." The words carried weight. For decades, mistrust between neighbors had kept unity fragile. Yet the image of gold seized overseas had left a scar deep enough to force cooperation. On the ground, preparations began. Special units were assigned to guard gold convoys inside national borders. Contracts with Western refineries were quietly reviewed and, in some cases, cancelled.